Let's roll. We are here to talk about our dreams. We're going to fantasize today. It's fun to fantasize, especially when you're locked away, which most of the world is. What are we fantasizing about? Today's episode is going to be the next Sony Alpha 7 fantasy camera. Hasn't the Sony Alpha 7 been an interesting journey of late? It certainly has. For some reason, we've got the Alpha 7R IV, so it's in its fourth iteration. We've got the A7 III in its third iteration, and we have the A7S in its second iteration. And the big question is, why is Sony upgrading some of these cameras and not upgrading others of these cameras? And I want to talk about my fantasies for the A7S, the straight A7, and the A7R, because they all have different places and directions that they can go. Now, let's start perhaps where the most frustration lies, and that's with the A7, the straight A7. Now, that's probably the camera that sells the most units in that range of Sony cameras. It's probably the one that people are most waiting for. Traditionally, it sits somewhere in the 20 megapixel range. It has great 4K, and this is where it is today. And even today, it is still considered a fine camera, even so it's a number of years old. But what would be my fantasy specs today? Well, it's interesting, isn't it? With everything that Canon has done just in the last month or two with the R5, and there is the rumoured R6 to come, there's a lot that Sony needs to step up to, quite a lot. And I suppose the headline feature is this 8K video. But I think we need to really tread carefully when desiring 8K video and wanting it in a camera that's not the top of the range camera. Because I think any manufacturer that sticks 8K in a camera is probably going to charge top dollar for it. So we can't have our cake and eat it. I know most of us here on the internet, we get angry and we bang the desk when things don't quite go our way. But I do think we need to be realistic. The A7R series is sort of the top of the range in that segment. We're not talking about the A9, we're talking about the A7. So the R is the top of the range. So that's the most likely place you would see the 8K. It's the most expensive. So even when dreaming about what the specs of the A7 IV should be, I don't want it to be too expensive, which means I don't want it to have 8K, but I do want it to have 120 frames per second, 4K. That's number one. What about having more megapixels in an A7? It's a really difficult question. 24 megapixels where we're sitting right now is actually a really sweet number, and it works on all sorts of levels. And the more pixels you get, the more megabytes you need, the more storage you need in your camera, the faster the processor has to run, and the less frames per second you can take. That's why the A9, the Sony A9, is not 50 megapixels. It just simply couldn't move as fast if it was. So as for the dream, the spec for video and for stills can be roughly where it is. 24 megapixels is enough. 4K, 120 frames per second, yes, we want that. But a lot of the other changes are other things, like ergonomics. For me, my fantasy Sony camera is going to have a larger grip. Here is the Sony A7 III. Now, I find this grip to be far too small. You can watch a video up here how I talk about all that stuff at length. This is a great camera, and I know the Sony A7 IV does have a larger grip. Haven't tested it. If it's big enough for my hands, then in the Sony A7 IV, I would like the grip of the Sony A7 IV. So ergonomics is number one. One of the most critical things that I would like to see in the Sonys, and I don't know if the logic is there to do it, but on a Nikon camera and on other manufacturers, I think Fuji do this, when you're in stills mode, you're in stills, you set all your settings, and there they are. Then when you flip to movie mode, you have a second whole set of settings, so you can set up for movie mode, and there they all are. And then when you flip back to stills, the settings you had on your stills are still there. Now, I cannot stress enough how cool and important and useful and ergonomic as a professional photographer, or any photographer who wants to work quickly and flick between stills and video. You might have an amazing bird sitting on a log and you want to get 3 seconds of video and you want to get the stills. With the Nikon, you flick a switch, everything's ready to go. You flick another switch, you're in stills. You flick another switch, you're in video, and your settings change. Sadly, right now on the Sonys as they stand, you flick between the two modes and you only have one set of settings. And so you cannot keep a sandboxed version of settings for stills, and you cannot keep a sandboxed version of settings for video. In real world usage, under pressure, this is a massive frustration, and this would be absolutely a tentpole dream update to the Sony camera, something as simple as that. Now, I don't know, that might run quite deeply into the logic and the pipeline and how the whole thing's programmed, but I really, really hope they can do that. That'd be huge. As we know, Sony are going great with their lenses, so there's not a great deal to talk about from a lens perspective. Keep up the good work, lenses are great. As we move into the decade of the roaring 20s, it's time perhaps for the SD card to be a little less ubiquitous. And Sony's coming in at a good time where CF Express is now being created by somewhere between 15 and 20 manufacturers. It's not beholden to Sony and just Sony doing it anymore. Prices will start to come down. Canon are now starting to use the format as well as Nikon. This is just going to continue to be a better format. So I would like to see a minimum of one CF Express and one SD slot. I'd prefer to actually just see 2 CF Express slots in my semi-professional / professional level camera. An A7 IV can certainly be used for professional work. So I would like to see this standard moving into the future, because if Canon and Nikon are doing it, and it's becoming the professional standard, I think Sony want to be there too. So I would love to see that professional standard there. And I think that's, even if you had the two, the SD and the CF Express, which is what the D850 essentially has. It has an XQD slot and an SD slot. And look, that gives you the best of both worlds. Not bad, it works, it's all right. So better cards would be awesome. Next thing I want to talk about is this little guy here. This little guy here. I bought the A7 IV before I bought the Z7, and the Z7 has a better viewfinder. So what I would love to see here is the viewfinder, and at least the viewfinder that we have in the A7 IV, which is an improvement over the A7 III. So the A7 IV, it's a lot of numbers and designations here, isn't it? If you get confused, imagine how I feel. The A7 IV definitely needs an improved viewfinder, definitely. It's now, I think, 3 years old, and it just needs more millions. I think we should be up around the 5 to 6 million pixels in here by now. The other thing that I find is lag, a bit slow, and depending on settings and depending on what you're doing and depending on if you're shooting 4K or 1080p, the resolution actually drops in here, which the Nikons don't do. So I'd just like to see that whole engine improved. It's time. It's time. Come on, this is my dream. I want to have this closer to the real world. The A7 III was a great step. It was the next step, and then the 7 was above, the Nikon Zs were above that, and the A7 IV is probably above that again. It's another year has marched on. So, improved viewfinder, yes indeed. Battery life. Let's talk a little second about battery life. Well, honestly, I've never really had a problem with battery life, even when battery life isn't that good, because at the end of the day, if you're somebody who's passionate about photography, professional, amateur, hobbyist, doesn't matter, spending another $50 or $100 on another battery or two, that's the least of your problems. So honestly, plus pretty much every camera these days you can plug in a larger battery and just charge it on the fly, and that's fantastic. So battery life, it only gets better year on year anyway. So it's going to improve. It's already great on these. So battery life is cool. Now, one thing we saw in a video that you can watch up here, we saw a different graphical user interface between the Nikon and the Sony. I think the user interface of the Nikon is much more elegant and not as cluttered and easy to read, and all these sorts of things. It's just a nicer, higher quality, like literally the pixels being applied seem to be higher quality. I would like to see that improved. Now, there's another contentious one, which, and we're talking about my dreams, right? This is my dream, and that is the menu system. I actually don't believe this is something that Sony could fix, but if they could, I would like less top-line subsections, and those subsections to just be a bit deeper. It's like a book that's just got a lot of chapters, but each chapter doesn't have many sentences in it. And I find it a weird approach. Menus, just a bit better. Although, yeah, I don't think they can change them. Let's talk about focus. You'd think Sony could do better, wouldn't you? You'd think they could do better. I mean, their focus is absolutely terrible. You know I'm joking. Sony, best in class focus. Nothing to say there, Sony. Keep up the great work. We've got amazing eye detect, face detect, pet detect, and I have heard a rumour that they are working on vegetable detect. I'm poking a little bit of fun. Of course I am, because Sony are top of the class when it comes to focus. There is absolutely nothing to talk about here. If they just keep iterating as they are going to continue to lead the pack. Great work on focus. My dream is already, to be honest with you, in my world, they are already beyond my dream. I'm just like in a fantasy full of chocolate. I want to touch on colour science, colour profiles. Having obviously seen a lot of what Canon do, and having seen obviously what Nikon does and Sony, I kind of feel like the Sony colour science is the one I would like to see most improved. That's the certificate it's going to get in today. And that certificate is, I'd like to see it most improved. So can we improve that? I'm not sure what they're going to do. Everyone kind of does it their own way, and maybe some people love the way the files look. It's one of those things that's subjective, so let's please stay calm in the comments. Colour profiles. We all see colour differently. At the end of the day, I'm kind of colour science agnostic, because you can fix it in post, and it's a very minor and a very quick fix. Easier with stills than with video, of course, but you can. This stuff is minor. But Sony, I want it to be better. Thank you. So look, frame rates is another thing that we could talk about here. As I've said before in previous videos, you can check out my Nikon Z8 Dream camera video right here. I'm not a frame rates guy. Like I've said, I've used my camera at its fastest speed, whether it was my D3, my D4, my D850. The D850s go 9 frames a second. The D4 I think is 12 or 14 frames a second. I've used them at full tilt like 3 times in 30 years. That's it. So my dream camera, I don't really care. For others, I don't know. I think we're getting to a world here where video, higher end video, especially if you've got 8K, which this camera won't, I think there's going to be a hybrid thing that happens in the next 3 to 5 years. And I don't know, for those who actually want a high frame rate, I don't think you should be looking for it in a $2,000 to $3,000 camera, or a $1,500 to $2,500 camera. I think you're dreaming too hard. You're wanting too much. Your expectations are too high. Frame rates are good, Sony. Stick with what you've got. You're doing great. Love it. So that is my fantasy. If I could have the A7 IV tomorrow, it would have those things. It would have 4K 120 FPS. It would have a better viewfinder, you know, more pixels, high res, all that sort of stuff. It would have 2 CF Express slots. It would have improved menus. Focus is, ergonomics. Yes, the other thing was I really just want them to be a bit bigger. For example, the Nikon, all of them, even the Z50, has 2 buttons here. This button here, I don't know if you can see it, but this button here is the lens release button on the Sony, whereas the lens release button on the Nikon is over here. Here's a really close look at the buttons on a Z6 or Z7, the function buttons, which we can see here and here, versus what it looks like on a Sony Alpha 7. As we can see here, there are no function buttons under the fingertips. There is just the lens release button. And that's a fundamental ergonomic difference, which I do think is an advantage for the Nikon and a disadvantage for the Sony. Just to flip back again, the Nikon has the lens release button over here, completely on the other side of the camera, where your hand is never holding because your left hand is holding the lens. That is best practice. Another little ergonomic thing. And I know that there's other function buttons around on the camera, but these ones are they're literally where you're holding. Actually, you could accidentally remove the lens with this. I've never thought of that. Anyway, they're right here, so that makes them very, very useful. So that could be another change. Just give us anyway, they're never going to move the mount release. That's never going to happen, which means there'll never be buttons here because people will accidentally press it. That's bad luck, but that's a dream. Great work with the Sony A7 IV Dream camera, coming any day, I'm sure. Come on, Sony. Thank you very much for being here. If this is your very first time here, it has been so good to see you, and I would love to see you again, so please subscribe. And if you want to hear about every single thing I do, click on the bell down there, just give it a bit of a tap, and you'll be notified every time. Please like, please share, and I'll look forward to seeing you very soon. All right, bye. Mark, can you make me disappear like you did in that other episode? That'd be amazing. I loved that.